Welcome to a new episode of Governance this week. Recently, EU leaders opened accession negotiations for Bosnia and Herzegovina EU membership. This puts the country one step closer to joining the bloc. Today, we will be discussing progress towards integration of the Western Balkan region as a whole and the challenges and opportunities of this process, both for the Western Balkans and the European Union. We are joined by Fabrizio Tassinari, Executive Director at the Florence School of Transnational Governance. Thank you for being here with us, Fabrizio, once again.
Pleasure.
So let's start with the EU enlargement process. What do you think are the pros and cons of letting new member states in the Union?
The enlargement has always been part and parcel of the EU's peace project. It's been about reuniting Europe. It's about encouraging transformation of the countries from the inside. And over time, perhaps not by design, but it has become Europe's most successful foreign policy. The ability really to drive this transformation has been in and of itself an element of huge success. Over the past couple of years, primarily because of the war in Ukraine, the narrative as well as the mindset behind enlargement has changed. It has acquired what I would call geopolitical connotation. It's been about really responding to a threat, namely Russia's aggression, and therefore the idea of expanding the Union in that sense, it's also very territorial. It's essentially about expanding the space of peace in a phase, and a historical phase in which peace is receding from Europe. So I would say it is still a foreign policy tool about which we could discuss the effectiveness, but the question is whether it works as a geopolitical tool as well.
Excellent. So let's zoom in on the Western Balkans now. Since 1999, the European Union has made its commitment towards integration of the region very clear. What do you think is the relevance of these accession talks, and how can this process be beneficial for both parties?
Yes, one cannot overstate the importance and the significance of the enlargement in this particular region, because it stems from a history that now feels a little bit far away and forgotten of conflict and of extreme violence, ethnic violence that was perpetrated in the region during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And I think it's fair to say that at that time, the European response was underwhelming. At the time, in the early mid-90s, the EU would say that this, meaning the war in Yugoslavia and in the heart of Europe, would be the hour of Europe. That was the phrase used, unfortunately, at that time, because clearly we didn't meet the expectations. So in a sense, the enlargement since the wars in the region subsided has been the main instrument that the EU could put forward to show its commitment to peace in the region. And I would say that comes with a symbolic message, peace, but it also comes with concrete deliverables and things that actually need to be done on the ground. Because when you come out of a conflict like that, it's not only about reforming your government or changing a few policies. It's really about rebuilding a state. It's about rebuilding a country. It's about creating new constitutions. So EU enlargement has also been about that. Scholars call this member state building. It is about state building through membership. And that has been extremely complex in cases like Bosnia and Herzegovina, precisely, but also Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia. And I think there is still some way to go.
Yes, complex, exactly, but and also very long. With some countries like North Macedonia having applied for EU membership about 20 years ago. Why do you think this is taking so long? Is there some sort of enlargement fatigue at the EU level?
I think the answer there is twofold. There is certainly an objective fact and factor which has to do with the sheer scope of the reforms that the countries have to make and their ability and willingness to actually make them. As mentioned before, this would be as much about economic transformation, as much about reshaping the constitutional setup of some countries. These are really complex reforms, and it would be unfair to claim that they can be implemented overnight. At the same time, there is a less objective factor, which is the fact that after the enlargement in 2004-2007, the EU went through a long phase of self-reflection, self-absorption, which entailed effectively that enlargement as a priority would go a bit lower in the list of EU preoccupations. Remember, this was the time of the financial crisis, the euro crisis, the migration crisis. So, of course, this meant that for about a decade and a half, the enlargement process has effectively been stalled in this region, and the side effect of that is that the moment that the process stalls, the EU loses credibility in the region. So it's a little bit of a vicious circle. The less credible the EU is, the less a country is willing to do reforms. So I think it's fair to say that the time has come for a rebooting of that process and really rejuvenating the momentum behind enlargement.
And since we spoke about reforms, obviously the Western Balkan region and the various countries face different challenges internally before like being integrated into the European Union. How do you evaluate the different readiness of the various countries within the Western Balkan region, and especially in comparison with other candidates like Ukraine and Moldova?
So I would say each case it's its own. I think there was a time, especially in the mid 90s and the early 2000s, when an argument was made that in order to precisely signal the symbolic element in enlargement, you would encourage these countries to access the EU all at the same time, or try to. I don't think that's realistic. It's not realistic because each of them are in different stages. In some countries, there are issues of statehood. I mean, whether the country exists and in which constitutional setup. In other countries, there are issues of governance and state functioning. So each of them is in a different state, and it is, I think, entirely fair to assess them each in their own right. There is, however, as you mentioned, the additional component now that has been added by including Ukraine, Moldova, and prospectively Georgia to the process. And there the comparison is interesting because also in that case, you have yet another different situation. In fact, one in which the territorial integrity of the countries concerned is questioned, or rather, it's not there because they are invaded by a foreign power. And there, however, the EU has been much faster in acting in response to the geopolitical imperative, which was caused by war. So then the problem I see is that the enlargement is intended to be an inherently technical, technocratic process where you assess a country and its progress, how far they've come, and you evaluate. But then there is the political dimension, and the political dimension is not neutral. I mean, that you make you need to make a political call, a political decision about whether to advance or not, and it is, it would be unfair for the EU to claim that some of these reforms and some of the demands are entirely neutral and technical. Some of them are political. They are about entering the EU as an area of peace and as a project of peace. And I think there we need to balance these two imperatives. You cannot have them running in parallel and ignoring each other. There is a political imperative and there is certainly a technocratic one.
And would you say that these accession talks for Bosnia and Herzegovina point towards the right direction? Are there like a further step for like the Balkans as a...
No, there is clearly a recognition, precisely in light of the war in Ukraine, that we need to change gear in the Balkans, because it would be double standards. If you advance in Ukraine and Moldova and the Western Balkans are left behind, you're going to have a problem in your hands. So there is certainly a need to reboot the process or sort of inject a new momentum. The decision made by the European Commission about the creation of a growth fund is certainly going in that direction, because it is really about encouraging reform by means of incentives, which is really the original mechanism. We will need to see whether this will be taken up in the region and how, but certainly there is this impetus, and I think it is badly needed.
Thank you, Fabrizio. So we will be following the updates from the Western Balkans in the coming months. And thank you for being with us today, and stay tuned for more governance this week.